that want to follow along with these slides at a later point. But we're going to start with a quick update on how the enforcement trainings are going and the status of the materials that you all are expecting. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can use crash data to help inform some of our activities that are part of the Watch For Me program. And then the third part will be hearing from everybody on the line what activities you're doing and any questions that you may have. And for that, we will be able to open up the lines and make folks panelists, or if you would prefer, you can just enter your information into the chat or the question box. But we're really hoping to hear from folks and have a dynamic discussion today. We don't have time to answer all questions that we might have about crash data, but we really wanted to start this conversation, and it's a topic that we haven't covered in the past for the communities that have been part of the Watch For Me program for a long time. So we'll jump into the housekeeping items first and give you a sense of how the enforcement trainings are going. We are now about halfway through. We started in the coastal region and are working our way inland. We had some really great trainings, particularly the new courses with the new communities in Elizabeth City and Burgaw. We had some great attendance there. As well as in Apex, bringing together all the Triangle Region officers. And I think we're expecting a pretty full house in Elon and in Newton, the other new communities. We still got some time for Charlotte and Asheville to fill some more seats, and I think we've been coordinating with the folks over there and making sure that we're going to have a lot of officers there. The training course in Greensboro, at this point, we're not sure we're gonna reach our minimum threshold, and so we're suggesting that any officer who's interested in the Greensboro region might consider attending the course in Elon. And certainly, if there are officers from any of the regions that have already received training that didn't get to attend because of a conflict on that day, they are welcome to attend any and all of the other trainings. We do have space available for that. So Kristen, is there anything you wanted to add about the trainings? Do you want to share the link on how folks can sign up if they haven't already?
Sure. If you are still looking and interested in registering for a Watch For Me training, you can go to watchformenc.org, and I'm putting the link right now in the chat box. You should see it come through. So please do register in advance for some of these trainings. We've had really good attendance so far. People have been really engaged. I think that there's an opportunity to learn something for everyone.
Yes. And I don't know if Officer Massengill is on the call, but he's the sergeant that's leading our, I guess actually lieutenant now, who's leading our training courses. And we've been compiling the feedback, and so far it's been very enthusiastic response to his instruction. And a lot of agencies, it sounds like, are really using the training course to kind of mobilize their departments and get plans in place. And so we're really excited to see, what they're taking away from the course. And if you have any other feedback on the course, we're always receptive to that. I know Brian makes changes, throughout the year to make sure that the course is really addressing the needs of the people participating. So onto the material items. As folks who have been at the trainings know, most of the print materials are being distributed at those courses. There has been a delay in a couple of items. The bike lights are expected to be in a couple more weeks. And the armbands and bumper stickers are still out for procurement, and so those might be another month or so. But as soon as NCDOT has those items in-house, we will be coordinating with you to make sure that we can deliver those remaining items. The other thing we've heard is that there's a lot of interest in the clean graffiti. That is a service. NCDOT has contracted with that vendor to provide clean graffiti at a number of locations, but again, their budget is extremely limited. And so if you have an interest in that and want to pursue that on your own, we've listed the vendor that provides that service on the partner resource website. And we've heard that a number of folks are reaching out and buying additional items and bike lights as well. So if you have any questions about those materials, I've included Kristen's email there. You can reach out to her or me or type any questions you have in the chat box. So we also wanted to alert you to a couple new resources that are online. Last week, NCDOT delivered the first of 2 videos that they're putting out to help show some of the changes in the law that allow drivers to cross a no passing zone to give bicyclists more space. They've put that out there. If you are on Facebook, if you want to use the Watch for Me NC as part of your hashtag and share those, I think they are a valuable way to help communicate some of these changes to the public. The other resource that we have on the website now, if you go under watchformenc.org/about, you will see the 2016 final report as well as links to all of the community profiles. So we now have more than 25 communities that have shared with us who they're partnering with, what activities they've been doing, and what their outcomes have been to date. And that's really invaluable for people to get a glimpse into what effective local programs are looking like. And so, and we spend a lot of time tracking down that information and writing those up. So I hope they're useful to you. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns about what you see, if you check out your community's profile and you want to change anything or you want to add new information, we do monitor those and make updates throughout the year. And we're really happy to accept any additional information or images that might enhance your community's profile. So now I'll get right into the crash data discussion. And again, if folks have questions along the way, if you want to raise your hand or type something in, Kristen is going to be letting me know if there's things that I need to stop and address along the way. Otherwise, we'll also have time at the end for people to enter in questions. So I think one of the big points I wanted to make is that crash data is not just for engineers. We might be most familiar with our engineering counterparts using it to develop collision diagrams, to understand crash patterns and apply and evaluate infrastructure treatments. But we can also use it for helping us think through what crashes are happening at the population level and who is involved and how things are changing and how that might inform what we're doing as part of the Watch for Me program. So take this pie chart, for example. It might be a little hard to read some of the text, but this is showing 7 years worth of crash data for bicycle crashes in the Watch for Me participating counties. And you can see that one of the bigger wedges there is the blue wedge showing driver overtaking at 14% of all crashes that are occurring. That's one of the behaviors that's attributed to the crash. And so we can learn from that and help tailor our goals and activities and focus some of our messaging. That analysis is what led us several years ago to start focusing the message on making room for bikes to help encourage drivers to pass bicyclists more safely. So you can think about it from the behaviors that are happening and then also look at where the crashes are occurring and if there is a role for law enforcement in addition to infrastructure needs at those areas. And then another use of the crash data is just to keep checking in over time. And sometimes this is really challenging for the smaller communities that don't experience many crashes. You know, it's actually a very good thing that you don't experience crashes, but it makes it harder to know how things are changing. And sometimes you have to look at more years of data, or you have to look at your community's data kind of aggregated with other similar areas to see the bigger trends that might be occurring. And so that's what we're going to try to help with a little bit today is to show some of those trends in different locations. But I think I wanted to start and take a step back and make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to the basics of crash data. I know some of you are extremely familiar with using and actually involved in collecting the data that goes onto crash reports, but other folks may not, on the call, may not be using it on a day-to-day basis. So I thought I'd start with a step-by-step of how a crash report originates and where it goes. So the officers on the call might be very familiar with this form. It's the DMV 349 form. This is triggered when a crash occurs and involves an injury or any property damage of more than $1,000. And typically the crash has to occur in the public right-of-way for this report to be filed. But we know from looking at the data that sometimes we still get reports in our system that are, actually occurring, near trails and in parking locations that are actually slightly off the right-of-way. But once this data is filled out, once this form is filled out by the officer responding to the scene, it goes into a larger database that is housed at the DMV. And some of these files are shared electronically, but a lot of agencies are still using paper forms and sending these, and they have to be hand entered into the system. So when you see that our crash data are lagging behind real-time events, a lot of that is attributed to just the process it takes to gather the data from all the agencies. But in North Carolina, the DMV shares that data with UNC Highway Safety Research Center. We are under contract with GHSP and with NCDOT to help clean and manage that data. And so one of the first things that we do with pedestrian and bicycle crashes is we apply PBCAT, which is the Ped Bike Crash Analysis Tool. And it's a tool that was developed by NHTSA, actually with HSRC staff several years ago. It's probably in need of an update, but we still use it in North Carolina. And what it does is it helps us understand all the pre-crash actions and behaviors and the location and context of the crash so that we can put crashes into a group and help us understand the patterns that are happening for those groups. And so we're one of the few states across the country that actually apply crash typing software to our data systematically for the entire state. So we have really great data in North Carolina, and I think a lot of folks are not aware of how useful this data can be and how available it is. But the other piece that HSRC does is it reads through every crash, it reads the narrative, and tries to use all data available to pinpoint where that crash occurred and apply those coordinates so that we have geocoded crash data across the state. That process began in 2007, so every crash that's happened since then has been data that we're trying to have a strong geocode for. And then we make that data available through the NCDOT website. And so folks can play with it, they can map it, they can zoom in and see where crashes are happening. And the hope is that this data is used by agencies. We know that it's used for development of the statewide plans that are happening, the Ped Bike plans and others. But we also know that a lot of the communities that are involved in NCDOT's planning grants use this data as well. And so, Kristen, can you let me know, did we have anybody join us from NCDOT? Looks like Sean Troy is with us now. I don't know if he has audio yet.
We do have audio. Can you hear us?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sean. So I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you and whoever might be with you on the call to the rest of the Watch For Me communities. Sean, can you tell us just which, I guess you've got some folks there with you from the Traffic Safety Unit?
Yes, ma'am. So we have Mr. Brian Mayhew. He's our He's the state traffic safety engineer. We have myself, Sean Troy. We have Chris Oliver, and we have Stephen Lowry. Stephen runs our HSIP group, and Chris is plays a lead role in our executive committee for highway safety.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today as we talk about crash data. And I know you all work very heavily with this data for NCDOT. Is there anything that you would like to share now with the Watch For Me communities about how you're using data and you know, how you might interact with some of these communities as they're looking to better understand their crash data?
Yeah, this is Brian Mayhew. We do use bicycle and pedestrian crash data as well as crash data for all vehicle crashes. And really, it's integrated into all of our programs and pretty much all of our decision making. So we do rely on that a good bit. We work with DMV to help collect good quality data, and we work with law enforcement to help improve the data. You know, there are limits to crash data, as you guys have mentioned, especially in the bicycle pedestrian crash area where fortunately the crash numbers are relatively small. So a lot of our programs are focused on identifying patterns of crashes, and in bicycle and pedestrian, sometimes with the numbers being small, it can be difficult to identify patterns, but certainly in a lot of the urban areas and areas where there is a lot of pedestrian activity, it is possible to use crash data and clearly identify patterns and work to treat those patterns. Additional data is always useful, such as land use, transit use, you know, knowing as much as we can about exposure. And a lot of that takes just, you know, field investigations and observations. And that's always a very important part of our programs here.
Mm-hmm. Brian, thank you so much. You're doing my job for me. I think you've touched on a lot of points that I'm going to be reinforcing in the coming slides. So
excellent.
We really value that perspective, and I agree. We have a lot of opportunities, but limitations that we're aware of with the crash data that we use. So does anybody have any questions now before we move on a little further? We'll keep going. So Ed Johnson wasn't able to be on the call, but he also felt like it would be really useful to show a little bit more, kind of open up the box of what crash variables are included in crash data and how we can analyze them and learn from some of those trends. So this is just a laundry list of all the data that's gathered and added to the crash data. And then I'll go through a few slides to show you, you know, just some snippets of how we've been looking at the data to help understand some of the trends for Watch For Me communities. So the first thing we tend to do is to try to look at crashes over time. And I mentioned we do have a lag in the data because of all the processing, and so this really goes only up to 2014. Most of the communities on the call today haven't joined Watch For Me by this point. So it's, you know, one of the things that we're always curious about is who joins the Watch For Me program and who doesn't, and how does their prior crash experience determine whether they want to be part of this program. And with the bike crashes, particularly the fatals, we're fortunate in North Carolina to have such you know, so few fatal experiences that the data are very noisy, and there's not a lot of, you know, there's not a lot that we can glean from those trends. But when you have more crashes, such as the non-fatal, you start to see slight patterns in the data. And you can see that statewide, the non-Watch For Me communities might be experiencing a slight decline in bike crashes, whereas the folks that have now joined Watch For Me tend to have, you know, pretty steady bike crashes, and maybe for the more populated areas, a slight rise. It's a little bit hard to tell from the bike data. But when you look at the pedestrian crash data, especially the non-fatal data, you start to see that, you know, over the past few years, we have been experiencing an increase in pedestrian crashes, very notably in those larger, more populated counties that are now part of Watch for Me. But that tracks very closely with the communities that have not yet joined the program. And so as we start to do our, you know, crash-based evaluations, we might be able to really understand the experiences of the Watch for Me community by comparing the trends to those folks that have not yet joined. But what we wanted to do is also dive a little bit deeper into the trends and see how the crash experiences differ amongst the different types of Watch for Me communities. If you look at those crash profile or those community profiles that are on our website, you can see that we have a real nice diversity of community types and sizes. We've got the beach towns, we've got the college towns, we've got the small kind of rural areas, as well as those, you know, very large urban regions like Charlotte and Raleigh and Wilmington. And so we thought we would spend a little bit time showing how the crash types differ amongst those different communities. So here's just an example where we've looked at the bike crashes by those communities. So it might take a minute to digest this slide because there's a lot of data presented here. But that top bar is representing crashes in the past 7 years that happened in the counties with Watch for Me communities that had less than 25,000 people in the Watch for Me city. And then it goes up to the mid-sized cities and then the large urban regions. And then we also just broke out the college towns and the beach towns and then included, just for comparison's sake, the non-Watch for Me counties at the bottom. So you can see how bike crash trends differ by region. And as Brian pointed out, a lot of this is probably due to exposure, that we don't have a really clear sense of how rates of bicycling differ and how exposure to different built environments might differ. But one thing you can see is that with the small, kind of more rural areas, they are experiencing more of that driver overtaking type of crash than a lot of the more urban regions might be experiencing. And I think we've heard that that issue mirrored and reflected in some of the observations by officers that, you know, crashes are happening on these windy rural roads where there's bicyclists trying to ride for recreation. Sometimes there's, you know, limited sight distance on some of the hills, and speeds are higher. So that's one of the issues that we're starting to see come out in the data for those smaller towns. For college towns, we see a different pattern of crashes, you know, when we look across the entire, you know, population of crashes that are occurring. And we see a lot more crashes occurring with driver turning or driver drive out at intersections or other kind of crossing an intersection type of crash. The other thing that we see more predominantly in college towns are the bicyclist overtaking, where maybe a bicyclist was in a bike lane and coming up on the right side of a driver, or maybe between drivers, and some of these dooring crashes are more prominent in the college towns. So that might make us think a little bit more about how we want to, you know, continue to investigate those types of crashes in these settings. And then if you look at the beach towns, you start to see that the crash type, you know, pattern there is slightly different as well. There's more non-intersection crashes where either a bicyclist or a driver came out from a non-intersection. And we might need to think more about the built environment as well as the behaviors that are behind some of these different types of crashes. On the pedestrian side, you can basically go through the same exercise and see differences in the patterns of the most common types of crashes amongst these different types of communities. So the smaller, often more rural cities tend to, you see a prevalence of the crash type where the pedestrian was walking in or walking along the roadway. Sometimes this has to do with limited infrastructure in these locations because they are more rural. They might be less likely to have sidewalks. But there's also a lot of other factors that might be contributing to these crashes. In the mid-sized communities, you're starting to see a lot of backing and parked vehicle crashes. Again, this might be related to exposure if these kind of suburban developments have more parking lots, surface parking, that can tend to be an issue. But when you also look at the college towns, you again see that issue of drivers turning and issues happening with intersection location crashes. And again, the beach towns, similar to the bike data, you're seeing more of these non-intersection type of crashes, dart and dash out in non-crossing situations. So I think it's useful to explore, and you can drill down further into these crash types by starting to look at crash types by age group. So for example, if you look at crashes involving youth less than 16, you start to see that a lot of them tend to be related to that bicyclist ride-out type. And same thing with the pedestrian type. We see a lot of children darting out of driveways or in unexpected locations. Whereas when you look at the senior population, you see a lot more happening with driver turning at intersections, driver drive out, and sometimes driver overtaking being a bigger factor in the crashes that are affecting seniors. And again, I'm just giving a flavor for the data and how you can drill down into it. There's endless ways that you could start to look at these, and we're happy to assist with communities that want to explore specific problems. But one of the things that we all tend to gravitate towards is looking at the severity of the crash and looking at who was injured. And this might give us a sense of certain groups that we might need to be really working with more hand in hand in the Watch For Me programs. So you can see here, in some of our smaller towns, we're seeing seniors being overrepresented in the fatal crashes, and that's actually pretty common. They are more fragile, and even at low speed crashes, seniors can be more heavily impacted with the crash severity than children or younger pedestrians and bicyclists. So if we're thinking about how to reach out to seniors and how to work around places where seniors might be walking, to access key healthcare services, we might keep that in the back of our minds as we plan our outreach and our activities. Same thing if you're working in a college town setting, it's just a matter of exposure that you would probably expect more youth involved in crashes at all severity levels. And beach towns also seem to be having more seniors involved in the more higher severity incidents. And that again may just be a factor of who's walking in those communities, but it also helps us think about if we can be partnering with AARP, or if we can be partnering with the local university, or if we're looking at child crashes, if we need to be working more hand in hand with Safe Kids, it gives us a way to think about who our partners might be in developing messaging and outreach strategies around these issues. So similar message, I think, on the pedestrian side. We don't see as much variability in terms of the population sizes. The graph on the left shows that you see about the same distribution across age for the rural and the large and urban communities, and it's pretty similar to the non-Watch For Me communities. But if you look specifically at the beach towns and the college towns, you do see that the distribution of crashes by ages is a little bit different. And so, again, it's just helpful to be thinking about the context in the area that you're working in and that you know, there's not necessarily an off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all type of message that we want to be putting out through the Watch For Me program. So I know a lot of officers and other folks on the call are really interested in, you know, when they should plan their enforcement and outreach, and, you know, how do they, you know, how do they be more impactful with their crashes? And I think a big question has also arisen around the issues of alcohol and distraction. So we'll touch on that a little bit. But this is just to give you a big picture view of the proportion of crashes that tend to happen at night with very low lighting. And so pedestrians, we have almost 40% of our crashes at night or dusk dawn hours, and it's a smaller percentage with bicycling. But I think it highlights the reason that the bike light giveaways and the reflective material are so popular, because the lighting issue is such a big part of the crashes that we're experiencing. And the other issue that is you know, always hard to address in any you know, intervention program is the alcohol and drug involved crashes. We're fortunate that, you know, this isn't a huge proportion of all of our crashes, but you can see specific crash types where it is you know, a pretty big problem. A lot of the driver overtaking crashes involved alcohol use on the part of either the driver or the bicyclist or both. And similarly, the ride-out crashes, where a bicyclist came out from a non-intersection location, alcohol or other drugs were suspected in a lot of those crashes. On the pedestrian side, certainly I think, as most people would expect, the crashes where somebody was either lying in the road, standing in the road, or walking in the road, those tend to happen at night, and when there's more alcohol involvement on either the pedestrian or the driver's side. And so I think, you know, these issues are difficult. We're all aware that you're not going to solve problems of impairment with a simple safety message online. It's not easy to change behaviors that are related to substance abuse and addiction, and it requires thought from all of our partners. But having the data, again, in front of us helps us think through where are these crashes occurring, who is involved, what time of day, who should we be thinking about partnering with, and what are other mechanisms that are addressing these issues that we might want to work through. Is it worth working through our checkpoints that we already have set up to better understand you know, where driver alcohol is impacting pedestrians? And is it worth thinking through the locations where pedestrian alcohol is a real problem that we might need to be considering other ways to start addressing these issues? So as Brian mentioned, you know, our interventions have their limitations, but we have to also acknowledge the limitations of the crash data. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Swiss cheese model, but I found this to be really useful in thinking through all the things that have to happen before a crash occurs that might trigger a crash report. So on that very front slice of cheese, you see a lot of holes. There might be drivers and pedestrians and bicyclists that are doing a lot of unsafe actions. And some of these might result in a crash and some of them won't because they haven't gone through that entire causal chain. But if there's the preconditions for the unsafe action, if we have an environment where pedestrians and bicyclists are sharing, you know, close proximity to fast-moving traffic, if we have other, you know, things that contribute to a crash like nighttime and poor visibility, and if we have organizational influences that can't, you know, address some of those issues, then those combined are the factors that are going to lead to a crash. And our crash reports don't always gather that type of information. We do try to have some officer judgment of who might have been at fault in the crash, but a lot of times we see that those variables are unreliable because, you know, the bicyclist or the pedestrian has been hit or killed and taken off the scene. They can't be a witness. We don't know what their actions were that might have contributed, and so we don't have the full picture. We also have certain data that aren't collected, so we don't know the role of distraction, and we can't really say how that might have impacted the crash type. And we don't always have good data at, regarding some of the other things that might have contributed to the crash. We don't know how fast the driver was actually going. In most cases, we rely on posted speed limit. And we also don't always know what kinds of injuries were actually sustained. Officers attend these crashes, they have a really good sense on if this was a disabling injury or obviously if this was a fatality, but a lot of times we don't know what happened, where the injury was, and if that might help us better understand how we might address those crash types. So we have those limitations, but that doesn't necessarily stop us from using the data that are available to help inform our decision making at all levels. And then the other issue is also, as Brian mentioned, that these data are very rare events, and we're fortunate that they're rare. We captured the deaths very well. We capture a lot of the serious injuries, but then we know that there are plenty more pedestrian and bicycle crashes that are happening that don't go reported, or incidents that are near misses or close calls that don't actually result in an injury. But we know that we have some research that shows that the more bicyclists and pedestrians are involved in close calls and near misses, the less likely they are to want to walk and bike in the future and to reach some of those public health goals that we have for increasing walking and biking. And so we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, but still I think the data that we have on hand is very important to factor in as we develop these interventions through Watch For Me and other kind of collaborations we're having with our engineering counterparts. So I wanted to do a quick poll of the audience now and see how folks on the call are using these data. Let me see if I can launch this real fast. And we'll give folks a couple minutes. And if you have been using crash data, either for pedestrian and bicycle master plans or for the Watch For Me program, if you've been using it in a certain way, we would love to hear from you. If you haven't, but you're planning to, we're also curious how you might be planning on using data in the future. Give folks another 30 or 40 seconds to vote. It looks like we've got about 75% of our attendees have voted now. All right. See if I can share that poll here. So it looks like 44% of those on the call have not dug into their crash data, but they're making plans. Some folks have been using crash data to ID enforcement locations, and it looks like a handful of others are using it in other ways. Would anybody on the call like to share some of their experiences? If you would, you can raise your hand, and I think Kristen could be able to unmute you. And again, we don't want to call anybody out, but we really want to start the conversation and learn from you guys on how you're using data and how we might help facilitate using crash data to help make more data-driven decisions.
So this is NCDOT again, and yeah, I mean, using crash data is kind of one of those, we often think of it as one of those first steps that you often take to try to start understanding what may be going on and to help focus on areas and often just to help prioritize. And it's like you've mentioned, it's not the only thing to consider, but it is a great first step, and it is a rich data source. We often use it for both planning purposes and trend analysis, but we definitely use it for investigations and much more location-based decision making. So, we might be looking at it from an area of, yes, there's identifying towns or counties or statewide trends, but then at some point the desire is to fix an intersection or to fix a corridor. And so then you really do need to dig in a lot deeper with that crash data, and as you mentioned before, then supplement that with additional information. One area that we use crash data a lot for, as part of a broader approach, is with our road safety audits. So we have done several bicycle and pedestrian focused road safety audits where we have a team of engineers as well as locals and law enforcement, and we'll look at an intersection or a corridor. And again, crash data is a big part of that, but it's just one part of that.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, thank you. Those are really good points. When we started the Watch For Me pilot program back in 2012, we had a very similar process. We looked at the crash trends for the different cities, and then we organized a series of field visits where we went out with the law enforcement and the public works departments and looked at some of the higher crash locations. We did that in Charlotte and Durham and Raleigh initially, and it is very helpful. I agree that the crash data is only the first step, but once you get out into the field, you see, all the different behaviors that are happening and some of the, the roadway environmental factors that are an issue. And I think it's a really important conversation starter. And the road safety audit process is very useful for bringing together those, different groups to be thinking about their different role in addressing the crashes. So we have some links to pedestrian and bicycle road safety audits, and I know NCDOT has an active project, right, where you're doing some of that work. Are you developing an additional guidebook? Is that correct?
Yes, there is currently a research project that is underway, and I believe should be wrapping up soon, that is hoping to kind of adapt the road safety audit process and provide information that may be kind of focused and maybe a little bit easier to consume for local governments.
Excellent. So yes, when those resources come out, I think this would be a great audience, and we can help distribute those new resources through the Watch For Me program. And I know there are some folks in Greensboro who've been talking about doing some kind of field assessment or audit. I think that is certainly something that HSRC can help coordinate, and maybe we can work with folks at DOT as well on that. So I'll move to the second poll.
Oh, Laura, before we move on, I just wanted to say we did receive a comment from Chief Hawk at City of Burgaw, and he mentioned that they use their crash data in bike and pedestrian planning for their city, so it actually informs some of their city plans.
Excellent. Yes, and another source, if you're in a smaller community, you might have limited resources. You might not be, able to really dive into a crash data analysis. But if you check with your local ped bike master plans, a lot of those do involve a pretty detailed crash analysis when they're understanding baseline conditions. So sometimes the analysis has already been done for you and can identify some of the hot spots that you could go then and assess those same locations on whether or not they might be good candidates for law enforcement or any other kind of activity.
And we also had one other question come in over the evening, which was from Asheville, but it was basically asking, what is the best source for crash data? And how can you kind of decide which source is the best for your community?
For pedestrian and bicycle crash data?
Yes.
So we think that the data that's available online, well, I'll get to that. How about let me curb that question for a minute, because I think I have a couple slides that that'll send you to those sources.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So let's go into the second poll and hear a little bit more about what other sources of data folks are using. We've heard that some, if we don't have a lot of crash data, we can fall back on some of these other data that might indicate safety concerns, public complaints, driver speeding, near misses that might have been reported, and maybe even data from these road safety audits if you were learning about safety issues through those events. I'll give folks just 10 more seconds to vote. And you can also enter in the other data that you're using in the question box. All right, we'll go ahead and close that. So it looks like a lot of folks are using complaint data, which we do here a lot, and also speed data. Not so much near miss data. If you are interested in thinking about near miss data, there's going to be a virtual conference held on July 25th. I'll be a panelist in it, and it's talking about the near miss as a data source for understanding issues. There's going to be folks from California State Highway Patrol. They're bringing together some local officers as well from California, and the bike advocacy community is coming together to talk about this, so I can share that event if you have interest in that. It looks like the majority of folks use complaint data, and that's pretty common. One of the things that we always have to be careful about with complaint-based systems is the equity issue. It's who's doing the complaining. And I know hearing from officers in Durham that it tends to be some of the more affluent neighborhoods that are complaining about problems that the officers sometimes see are actually more trivial when they look across, what's really happening across the community. And so, again, there are multiple data sources, and combined, maybe they can tell a better story and help us decide where we need to be. One of the messages that Brian Massengill puts out in the enforcement training is you always want to have a reason for being where you're being. And whether you're using complaint data or speed data, or if you're supplementing that with crash data, that helps give you, a stronger defense on how you are using your limited resources to address safety issues in the community. So thank you for participating. That's really always interesting for us to hear how folks are using data, and we welcome any other questions or comments.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that from NCDOT perspective is the complaint data, we're always aware of complaints, and certainly with DOT we receive plenty of complaints. Turning that into actual data would be, I think, a different step. But complaints certainly help bring attention to areas that people feel are in need. But we at NCDOT, we're going to supplement complaints that we receive with additional data, such as the crash data, the speed data, and in most cases, we're going to collect exposure data at a location, especially if we're expending public funds, fairly limited funds at that. Then we're typically going to go ahead and observe the location and collect exposure data.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Yeah, exposure data is one of the the holy grails for the PED-BIKE community and researchers, because so few agencies collect it. But NCDOT has been leading an effort for a while to do pedestrian and bicycle counting efforts, and I think we'll have more access in the future to higher quality exposure data on the pedestrian and bicycle side in the future.
And I'll just add that with complaint data, it's in NCDOT, and I'm sure in most people that are on this phone call, we look at complaints as an opportunity to provide customer service. But in terms of trying to have a systemic type of program that is focused on improving locations across the state, you do have to be cautious with complaint data, because it is certain people have the time and resources to complain, and that but we all know that there are many groups that that don't participate in that process. And so if you're only doing projects or focusing on complaints, you're probably missing a lot of areas that have a lot of needs, but nobody there's not been enough that's taken place for somebody to complain. So for us, we definitely look at complaints as customer service, but we're going to have as much of a data-driven program as we can do, because there are plenty of areas where people aren't complaining, but they have significant needs.
Mm-hmm. Very, very important point. Thank you. So let me get back to where are the question from Asheville on what are the best sources for crash data. So if you're willing to work with data that are high quality but have a slight lag, we've got the data available online from 2007 to 2014 that are there. I think Kristen is going to share the link to where you can find that data. The other portal that we have is the Crash Data Query Tool. So this is on NCDOT's website. You can go to a tab and explore pedestrian crash data. You can go to a tab and explore bike crash data. It goes actually beyond the 2007. It goes all the way back to 1997. And you can do queries to look at just the most recent 5 years. You can look at all years. You can do you can really download the data and do what you want with it. If this isn't, if doing individual queries is challenging and you want to work with us to get the data, the entire data set that's behind this tool, I believe we are able to share that information, and that it has been de-identified so that there are no privacy concerns. but I'm pretty sure we do that on a case-by-case basis. Brian, I don't know if your group works to share data from this tool in any way additionally.
Yes, we do. We also provide data. Pretty much any group or entity, whether it's a city, MPO, RPO, any sort of planning group, we receive many requests for bicycle and pedestrian crash data, both from an analyzed standpoint, but also the raw data. And so we will provide that upon request. And we also send people to the website that is on the screen now, and make sure that they're aware that is another resource. Sometimes it depends on if they're comfortable with the lag or not. Mm-hmm. I did want to point out, somebody mentioned what's the best source of crash data, and in many ways there's only one source. A law enforcement officer fills out a DMV 349, and that is the source of crash data. However, there's many ways to access that data. You can contact your local police department. They will have data. You know, some will have it electronically, some will only have it in paper. Obviously you can contact HSRC and through this website, and you can contact, you know, NCDOT. But there's, you know, the original source of the data is the same.
Mm-hmm. And some folks have, I know in Charlotte, you guys are working with your hospital injury prevention group. Hospital data is something we get questions about a lot. I've worked extensively with emergency room data. North Carolina has data, but it's harder to get. There's privacy issues, and the hospital data, while it gives you a much better sense of the nature of the injuries that are sustained, because it's gathered by patients who are visiting an emergency room, you don't often get the wealth of data that you want from like what you would get from a crash report. So you won't get as much information, and unless they wrote it down in the triage notes, you won't know if it occurred at an intersection or if it occurred at night, because sometimes when people report to an emergency room, they're coming a week or two later and saying, oh, my back still hurts, I was in this crash. So you don't know exactly when the event occurred or where. And so that's why we do point folks to the police report data most often. There is some effort underway to see how we can better link hospital and police reported data, and I think that would give us a bigger picture. Some cities and states in other parts of the country are working on this as well. But I think for now, the police reported data are the best that we have. A lot of folks do want the data more in real time, and they're not willing to, they don't want to see crashes from several years ago. The other data source, which I'm not as familiar with, is TEAS. Which my understanding is that it is more in real time, but it has not gone through the process that I described of being crash typed and geocoded and cleaned. So there's sometimes more potential for error in that data, in that, a pedestrian crash might have originally been classified as a bike crash or vice versa. And so there is more real-time data available, but if you want to try to compare over time or multiple years, you're better off going with the data that's been vetted and available on the website. So I think that really concludes the first hour that we wanted to spend talking about data. And if there are no other questions, we can move into status updates. And this is where, Kristen, I might turn to you and see, is it easier to open up all the lines, or for folks to just take a moment or two to type in some of their Watch For Me activities and plans?
I think we can go ahead and open up some of the lines. We've already had a couple of questions come in during the last discussion. I know that Sergeant Sarver had a question about using the data that was for NCDOT, so I can try to open the line up to him now. And Sergeant Sarver, you're unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
You hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
I don't think we can hear him anymore.
Did we lose you? Well, I can just ask the question that he had asked. He asked, for the roads that are under NCDOT control and have pedestrian crossings, what is the best way to communicate observed issues such as speed limit, signage, etc. with DOT in an effort to improve the safety at a crossing? And what does what does NCDOT need from them?
Yeah, the most direct way would be for them to, or for anyone to contact the local NCDOT division office, and you know, we can certainly send that information out to this group if that would help. That is the most direct way, where you're contacting the 14 field divisions are directly responsible to, you know, oversee and operate and maintain the roads. However, if anybody has a location that they have concerns about, they are more than welcome to contact me, and I will make sure that their request gets addressed either by our staff or by the field division.
And I believe on the Watch For Me Partner Resources page, we have a listing of all the field division contacts. We might have the communication contacts, but if we don't have the other lead engineer contact, we can add that information as well. So we expect that a lot of the Watch For Me communities are gearing up for their kickoff events if they haven't already had them. We know that National Night Out and back to school events in August tend to be very popular times to launch the Watch For Me campaign. Now that a lot of the officers are getting involved with the training and getting the materials, you're probably all making plans. So again, we would love to hear what plans you're making, and if you have questions, our next call will likely be in early to mid-September, and we'll really be wanting to hear what the communities are doing. If you have thoughts on what technical assistance topic area you would want us to address in that time, we're also very receptive to what you want for us to share. But we want to make sure that these meetings are tailoring to the questions that you have, and also an opportunity for you to highlight your activities with your peer group that are on the call. Kristen, do we have any other questions to address before we break?
We don't have any other questions. We just have a couple of comments from communities. Charlotte, they're looking forward to training later this month, and they're also planning a press event later in August. And then also City of Burgaw, they're planning a community-wide bike rodeo for August 26th, so people are filling us in about their outreach activities that they have planned for some of these Watch For Me techniques that they're learning.
Excellent, excellent. Well, keep in mind too, Charlotte and other folks, as you're planning your press events, if you see a role for NCDOT, I know Ed Johnson has offered to coordinate with his folks to see who might be available to be part of any of those events. Well, thanks to everyone everybody on the call today. I think it was helpful to hear how you're using data and to see what kind of questions you're having. And thanks especially to the crew at NCDOT. We really appreciate the support you all provide in providing and analyzing data and helping us understand the most important safety issues that we should be keeping an eye on. And we always enjoy hearing your perspective in these calls and the opportunity to collaborate. So with that, we will go ahead and end the call, and we will be providing the recording up on the partner resource page, and we'll be following up with some of the resources we mentioned today, as well as looking for your feedback on when we can schedule that September call. And until we talk to you next, we wish everybody well, and we're here if you have any questions. Thank you so much.